Hi there, everybody. Steve the Amateur Historian, coming to you from getting towards the southwesternmost kind of corner of southwest Portland, an area I'm getting to know a little bit better every day. And this is kind of an impromptu Historic Murders of Portland episode because today is actually, as I'm posting this video, this is it'd be the 84-year anniversary of this case. And this was a very prominent murder case, a very prominent killing that happened here in an area that's pretty nice, but fairly developed. You know, obviously you hear cars passing me. There's, you know, residences all around me. Is residence is a word? I'm not sure. Residenci. But if you go back to 1935, this area was a lot more rural, a lot more open, because Portland was still so much less developed than it is now. So it's the kind of place where you could commit a murder and potentially escape the crime scene a lot more than the possibilities of that happening today. So I'm approaching here. This is the intersection of 35th, which is this street, and Arnold, which is the crossing street. And if you stare, I don't know how well you can see it right now with the sun hitting me, but if you look off just across the street, right over here, you might start making out the outline of a massive stone. Now that stone has a plaque on it with information about an event that happened here in 1935. So here, this is a massive memorial piece. I mean, look at how big it is. And on it, marked in the memory of Deputy Sheriff Ernest C. Loll, who gave his life in the line of duty at this spot. September 29th, today's date, 1935, exactly 84 years ago today. This tablet placed in loving remembrance by his fellow officers. So according to this marker here, this site right here, where the marker is placed, is the exact site where Officer Ernest C. Loll was gunned down. Now, Ernest C. Loll, as the marker shows, he was a deputy sheriff for the police. And it's funny because, you know, with the bus trip I just made, I feel like I'm so far away from downtown. I'm so far away from where I live on the east side. It doesn't even feel like we're in Portland anymore, but we are actually still technically in Portland. It's just Southwest Portland is a lot bigger than you want to give it credit for, especially when you don't hang out here often and you've always lived on the east side. Now, on this particular evening, or it may have been early morning, I can't remember exactly, but September 29th, 1935, Ernest Loll was called to this general location. They say 35th and Arnold, so even if this plaque wasn't here, I would know it was the right spot. Some other reports mentioned a Stevenson Road, I believe, which may be like, you know, a block that way, I'm not really sure. All definitive sources said 35th and Arnold, and literally it's right in front of me. So he was, Deputy Sheriff Loll was called to this scene because locals had contacted the police claiming that people were bird poaching out here, pretty much in the city limits, going around hunting birds. And upon arriving at this location, there was a car parked in this vicinity. Maybe it was a little bit further up here. If this is the exact spot he was shot, then he would have parked his squad car right here and been probably closer to that vicinity, which means he probably pulled up behind a vehicle, so that vehicle probably would have been more kind of right here, so a little bit past here. And when Sheriff Loll arrived on the scene, he encountered two young men, both 23. One was named George Fiedler and the other August Weston. Now, both these guys had a criminal rap sheet. They were, you know, buddies in crime. They were people who spent a lot of time together and got a lot more evil done than good by just their influence on each other. And they were out here presumably poaching. So they had weapons on them. They had shotguns. You know, they were, again, you know, probably a lot of these homes look really new. Like, none of this was probably here. Like, pretty much none of these homes were probably here in 1935. There may have been a few, but this was probably very desolate. This was probably still like this may have even still been a gravel road that was barely ever traveled. Even right now, like, you only hear a few cars, like right now there's no traffic through here. Like, even 2019, it's really not that dense. So this would have been a lot more desolate back then. So these two young men, Fiedler and Weston, were out here essentially bird hunting in a place where they weren't allowed. With it being September 29th, I don't know hunting regulations, but it may have not even been hunting season, and either way, I don't think they were in an area where they were allowed to do that within the city limits. Again, I don't know hunting law that well because I don't hunt ever. I have no desire to. So he encounters these two men, and obviously Loll is not here to tell his side of the story, but according to the two men, he arrived on the scene, immediately pulled his, you know, service weapon, whatever that may have been, and said, you know, stop right there or I will shoot. Now, the story given by Fiedler and Weston essentially is that Loll apparently showed up and was ready to just straight up murder them. Fiedler in particular, and Fiedler seemed to be the more aggressive, the more homicidal of the two. Fiedler claimed that later that he shot at Loll because he was like, he pulled up, he said stop right now, he had his gun out, and I thought it's either me or him. Like, he claimed that he fired in self-defense, which I don't believe for a second. Portland police at that time had more than their share of corruption, but when you've got some guys out here for bird poaching, these guys weren't walking around, you know, killing people in this area. I don't think such a respectable sheriff was going to pull up and just leap out of his car and be like, well, you're just a couple of criminals, nobody cares, boom, boom, boom. Crooked cops might do that, but I don't think that was the case here. I think that was just something these criminals were coming up with. So it was Fiedler's admission upon being apprehended that he fired twice at Loll and hit him. Again, self-defense. And Weston said that he fired too, but he didn't fire until after Loll had been hit and was down on the ground and not moving. So both the men were able to flee the scene. There was actually some neighbors in this area. I don't know if they lived up this way or if they lived across the street here, but there was a couple, Mr. and Mrs. George Carl, who heard the gunfire and heard the two men getting into their vehicle that was probably more parked up here just ahead of the plaque, speeding off. And so they reported to the scene here where Ernest Loll was laying. He was still alive when they got there. They tried to get him emergency help, but it's very rural. It probably took a while for an emergency vehicle to show up, and Loll died before he could potentially be saved. So ultimately, these two men who fled in their vehicle, I don't know if they were facing this way or this way, but ultimately they beeline north and ended up in a small town in Washington that they were actually tracked to pretty quickly. They were found, I think, within 48 hours of the shooting. And again, they were apprehended. They both admitted shooting, but Fiedler admitted being the one that actually made contact and instigated the shooting, such and such, in the area right back behind me. Whereas Weston, they both kind of, ultimately, I think, were probably willing to throw each other under the bus. I mean, they're criminals first and friends second, probably. But it was, no matter which way they shook it up, it was pretty obvious that Fiedler instigated the shooting. He was the aggressor, and it seems like Weston probably fired either. I want to say he made the claim that Fiedler threatened to shoot him if he also didn't shoot at Loll. So he kind of, when Loll was on the ground, he kind of just fired just to keep his friend from having a manic attack and maybe shooting him as well. These guys are criminals, you know. So it seemed pretty clear, no matter which way you shook it up, that the events here that transpired were more instigated by George Fiedler's actions, and August Weston, not so much. They obviously were both involved. They both fled the crime scene. They both deserve to be brought to justice. But this is the unfortunate aspect of the case of what happened here. Is I want to say September 1935. It was autumn 1935. George Fiedler goes on trial first. Weston isn't going to go on trial till early 1936. And he, maintained it was self-defense. The officer was ready to shoot him, and he shoot him just to save his own life. Which I don't see how anyone would honestly believe that. But it created controversy. Obviously the prosecution tried to argue that, Loll hadn't even drawn his weapon on them. And it was a complicated situation, but it was a situation where, based on his extensive criminal history, the fact that he'd admitted to shooting, it was kind of shaky, the idea that he honestly did this in self-defense. It was surprising, especially back in the 1930s. You shoot a police officer, whether you claim self-defense or not, usually you're screwed at that point. But somehow, George Fiedler, the primary instigator, he escaped with a manslaughter conviction. I think he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Essentially a slap on the wrist for what happened, especially with the culture of the time. You do not shoot police officers. And so, of course, the city was just disgusted. The police, their union, was just disgusted. This was a horrible miscarriage of justice. This is the guy that admitted to being the primary shooter. But it seemed like the jury just couldn't really decide. Some people were for first-degree murder, some were for second-degree murder, some were for manslaughter. They met common ground at manslaughter because I guess they felt like they didn't want a hung jury. They didn't want this guy going free, but they couldn't decide between all of them exactly what they wanted to convict him on. So he escaped with a manslaughter charge. So then, early, I think January 1936, August Weston, the kind of toady, the sidekick, who only admits to firing at Loll. I don't even know if his shot hit Loll, but only admitted to firing after Loll had already been hit and was down and was pretty much done for. He goes on trial. There's all this animosity towards the case based on what happened in the Fiedler case. So with all this pressure and all this anger, this miscarriage of justice, August Weston, the less guilty of the two while he's still guilty, ends up getting convicted of second-degree murder and gets a life prison sentence. As, the guy on the side, Fiedler does 15 years for instigating the whole thing. But it was pressure, and it was politics, and it was, everyone was pissed about what happened to Fiedler, but Fiedler's been tried and convicted. There's no going back and redoing it. So, essentially, August Weston got a life in prison sentence for shooting at an officer who'd already been gunned down, essentially. While the one who did gun him down, the guy who actually should be primarily charged with murder in this case, did 15 years. Because people were pissed. It was such a horrible miscarriage of justice. It was backwards. Weston should have been doing a 15, 20 year sentence, whereas George Fiedler should have been the guy doing life in prison. He's lucky he didn't get the death penalty. But that is how the case ultimately went down. And actually, I've been hanging out under these trees. There's a little stretch here of woods that kind of go back. It's at least a couple acres. Again, the plaque, the site where, there's the plaque right there. That's where the shooting occurred. This massive area, it's, a green space, and it's actually named after Ernest Loll. If you look this place up on a map, you'll see that it's called, I forget exactly what it's called, the Loll Wetlands, or the Loll Nature Park Space. So even this area is named after Ernest Loll now, because it's right across the street, and one of the only spots here along this stretch that isn't inhabited. So he's got technically two kind of landmarks named for him based on the events that transpired right there at that exact spot, exactly 84 years ago today.